Hey everybody, welcome back to Video Game Esoteric Nerding series on the MiSTer FPGA DE10 Nano project. More specifically, in this instance, the work-in-progress Sega Saturn Core. And because this core just seems to be getting closer to the finish line, I figured I'd talk about a question I've been getting all throughout the core's development as we run previews, and that's whether or not this could run the Sega Titan Video version of the Saturn hardware. And if you're not aware, there was a release in the arcades called the STV, or Sega Titan Video, which is one-to-one identical hardware to the Sega Saturn as far as CPU, VDP1 and VDP2, as well as all of the sound hardware, but it has a JAMA edge. It runs cartridge games, not CDs, and it does have some exclusives and games that have some differences. Because as much fun as something like Astro Superstars is here on the Sega Saturn Core preview footage, it is a lot of fun to play the arcade version of the game as well. Because again, there are a few exclusives on the board, some of which are even worth playing, and there are games that have completely different intro sequences like track modes compared to the Saturn counterpart. Because something like Astro Superstars here has a slightly different soundtrack using the cartridges versus the CD on the Sega Titan Video. Before we get too far involved though, do me a huge favor, down below hit like and subscribe and ring that notification bell, definitely helps us out. If you feel so inclined and want to support the channel, go to Patreon, link down below as well. But Mario Chandagu here is one of the exclusives as far as the Sega Titan Video is concerned, and it is a sponsored video game from a ramen company in Japan. It's basically just rhythm mini games. It seems very strange, and that's because it is, but it is a ton of fun to play, especially as a two-player experience. So stuff like this would be so much fun to actually have over on MiSTer FPGA. And even though the hardware is the same as far as the core silicon is concerned, there are some changes that would need to be fit into the core for this to happen. First of all, the controls would need to be pivoted because this comes into a JAMA edge, and then the Sega Saturn hardware ingests those inputs so that it can run. Secondarily, you do have a cartridge you need to load into memory versus actually using a CD, and on the FPGA code, that CD controller would be programmed in there, so you would have to have a different bit of silicon for that cartridge reading. Now the question is this technically possible? Of course it is. It's no different than a Sega Saturn, except it has a different medium as far as how the games come, and it has that JAMA edge as well as RGB output that's slightly different than the base console Saturn. The question is there still enough logic in the FPGA on MiSTer FPGA to actually accomplish this? And that's a very tricky question to answer, but it's kind of feeling like unfortunately no. This core is bumping up against the upper limits of what you can program onto the Triassic DE10 Nano Cyclone V chip, the same way that the Nintendo 64 core from FPGA Zoomspace did. So there might not actually be space to accommodate something like this. Now there could secondarily be another core, an STV core, that removes some of the CD controller parts and allows for you to actually have that ROM loading from the cartridge. That could be a technical possibility where there is a secondary core that removes all of the aspects that make a Sega Saturn a home console and replaces them in the FPGA code with all of the hardware that would be needed to be able to play the games off ROM cart, because it is a completely different medium and that does need to be accounted for. But there's so many, again, fun games on the STV, and a lot of the arcade versions are either going to have harder difficulties, different feature sets, different intro sequences, or different music. So it would be fun for posterity to have something like MiSTer FPGA run the Sega Titan Video, because games like Princess Daisuken here are just an absolute vibe and they're so much fun. And even though it did get a Saturn release as well, it would be fun from a preservation standpoint to have STV on MiSTer FPGA. And the reason you got so many ports from this arcade board to the home console is, again, the VDP1 and VDP2 chips are the same. You have the dual Hitachi SH2 chips, you have the exact same sound hardware. All you need to do is go from a cartridge to a CD. Basically think of it as the inverse of something like the Neo Geo CD at home. It had different hardware to load the CD data in, but it was still a Neo Geo AES or MVS at heart. And just because this could technically be possible doesn't mean it will happen. Maybe it's too much of a heavy lift to make a second core. Maybe SRG 320 just isn't interested in Sega Titan Video, which should be totally fine. We should be happy with what we get. But it is a situation where these boards aren't getting any more common and they're not getting any more fragile as the years go on. And because you do have that ROM cart, you sometimes do have different music in the games as well, which is always a fun time. So here's your soundtrack sample, but come back because I'll tell you more about the STV and why I think it would work on MiSTer FPGA. Awesome music, awesome game, and it's coming off the STV cartridge versus a CD, or moving over to something like Cotton 2, does have a few changes compared to the Sega Saturn version of the game, but I don't want you to think that STV somehow expands the Sega Saturn library by a ton. A lot of the exclusives do require very specialized controllers, and they really aren't the most exciting games in the world. You just get some of the same games you got on Saturn, but you get slightly different versions. Something like Virtual Fighter would be a good example remix. You're going to get a full 3D attract sequence versus the FMV video that played at the beginning of the game, because the Sega Titan video couldn't fit the FMV because it wasn't a CD system. So that's kind of fun just to see how the arcade originals would play versus something like the Sega Saturn ports. But the good thing is obviously STV emulates perfectly well in MAME, so you can check these games out if you are curious what the differences are right now, because there is no guarantee whatsoever something like this would come over to MiSTer FPGA, because obviously on the PlayStation 1 side of things we have the PlayStation 1 core, we have the PlayStation Turbo core, but we do not have a single arcade core as far as PlayStation is concerned. That is slightly more difficult because the PlayStation 1 arcade games did get different chips, including Q-Sound chips, and they did get a faster clock depending on the board we're talking about, and that's why Sega Titan Video is something that probably could be done if somebody wanted to do it, because you have the same chips running at the exact same frequencies, you have all of the exact same hardware, you just need to change how the controls work, you need to change how the games load in, and of course you need to incorporate the arcade BIOS, because this does not run on a standard Sega Saturn BIOS. It has its own custom BIOS because it is an arcade board. But obviously we know we have hundreds upon hundreds of arcade cores on the MiSTer FPGA side of things, so getting a BIOS file in there isn't the worst thing in the world. And there's just a lot of fun to be had on STV. Something like Steep Slope Sliders, weirdly enough made by Cave, the developer way more known for bullet hell shmups, started its life out on the STV board, and that's just again a fun piece of arcade in Sega history, and that's why I hope something like this could be possible and does happen in the future, because the more the merrier on the Sega side of things. But leave me a comment down below and tell me, did you know that there was an arcade board based on the Sega Saturn, or is this news to you? Because I feel like not many people knew about this, but if you did play Die Hard Arcade in arcades back in the day, you were playing the Sega Titan Video version of it, and that's what did get ported home. And in some instances the Sega Saturn version of the game is the de facto better version because it can have better Redbook audio or more features because it's an arcade port coming home versus just an arcade game. Although games like Groove On Fight, I actually prefer the Sega Titan Video version of it. There's just something about the difficulty curve that feels slightly more balanced in the arcades than when it comes home on the console. Maybe I'm just imagining things here, but this is the fun thing about MiSTer FPGA. For every single console there's pretty much an arcade board equivalent. The Sega Saturn had the STV, the Nintendo 64 had the Alex 64, and the PlayStation 1 had basically a dozen different arcade boards that ran on either base or upclock PlayStation 1 hardware, and that would bring in a ton more games even if all of the code could be reused. But even if it only takes 1% of the work as it took to actually make a Sega Saturn core, that is still a massive amount of work that only a few people can actually pull off. So again, don't expect this, just think about it and think what the possibilities could be. But one more soundtrack sample because I love the music in Groove On Fight, and I'll be right back. Now, even though that track is in the Sega Saturn version of the game, it does have a slightly tinnier, more hollow sound here that kind of sells that illusion of it actually being some Victorian era composition. So those are just some of the small changes between STV and Sega Saturn that you might actually want to play on MiSTer FPGA. But I've been getting so many questions as to whether or not the core is going to get cheats and Sega Titan Video support, and the answer is always, I do not know. I'm not the ones that make them. So honestly, if SRG320 is not in the mood, don't expect it and just be happy we have the Saturn core, but you never know what will happen. And it would be one of the quote-unquote easier things to do on MiSTer FPGA. But we're done. Hope you enjoyed the video. I'll see you guys next time. Bye-bye.